Hello and welcome to the Mind webinar on anxiety and young people. My name is Rai Kawanoka and I've been counselling young people since 2010. I've worked mostly in educational settings, both non-profit and private. I initially trained in humanistic therapy and cognitive behavioural therapy. I've lectured on foundation level and honours degree person-centred counselling courses. I'm relatively new to West Sussex and originally I'm from the States, so you may detect an American accent at some point. I'm a parent of two young people and I use the pronouns she and her. Before we go any further, I don't know what circumstances bring you here today. It may well be that some of the information I discuss potentially is upsetting, so I will do my best to be as sensitive to everyone's needs as possible. I'm hoping in this webinar that we will cover those differences between fear, typical worry, and diagnosable anxiety disorders, to know some examples of different types of anxiety, as well as common symptoms that can be observed or experienced, but also to consider what hinders and what helps those people suffering with anxiety who are in our care. So when I use the term mental health throughout this webinar, I'm referring to the really wide-ranging spectrum of experiences that all people have. Just like with physical health, our mental health is not a fixed state and can be impacted by many factors and treated in many different ways. Now, when using the term mental health today, I'm referring to this definition by Young Minds from 1999. With young people, it's particularly important to include this aspect of challenge, growth and connection. Obviously, things that are important to any human at any point in their life, but particularly with young people who are still kind of trying to find themselves, if you like. Now, if you've got young people or a young person in your life who perhaps is suffering with anxiety, you're certainly not alone, and there is a lot of evidence coming out recently that this is a growing problem, not just anxiety, but diagnosable mental health disorders in general. So it's worth noting that the NHS has conducted some recent surveys, culminating in a document published last year in 2021 that indicates, mental health disorders are on the rise, particularly with young people. This 2021 survey of children and young people's mental health found that, as you can see, 17.4% of children from 6 to 16 had a probable mental health disorder, and that's up from 11.6 just a few years previous to that in 2017. And then, among those aged 17 to 19, 10.1% had a probable mental health disorder in 2017, but it went up to 17.4% in 2021. It was found in this study that rates remained similar to some extent between 2020 and 2021. And what's worth noting here is that this is just one survey, and really the research into this is coming in thick and fast in the wake of the pandemic. But there's some evidence that this increase is not just due to the pandemic, but perhaps because people caring for young people have been spending more time with them, observing them more closely perhaps, and so maybe there's higher rates of reporting symptoms, but also just more opportunities to observe the young people in their care. It's also possible that increased media coverage has led to some pockets of targeted research into this area, which could also be influencing the statistics on this as well. So what exactly do we mean by fear versus anxiety or normal or typical worry? Firstly, fear. This is a good thing if there's something genuinely dangerous in our lives worthy of immediate attention. For example, if there is a fire in our home, our fight, flight, freeze instincts will be activated so that we can escape. And it's a natural reaction to real, but also imagined threats. It's less helpful as a response to non-threatening events, such as public speaking or dating or attending a job interview, but it is a natural and normal human emotion that typically serves a really important function. Anxiety, however, is more of a sense of apprehension at a perceived threat. Now, this could be an external or an internal threat. So either, the outside world is dangerous, or I present a danger to the others around me, for example. Now, this becomes a problem when there's a disproportionate degree of anxiety taking place at particularly unhelpful times, perhaps during work or school, or loving exchanges with people. It can often look a lot like depression, and indeed the two often overlap. Both fear and anxiety are normal, although some people get stuck in debilitating anxious cycles that have a really significant impact on their lives and keep them from enjoying themselves, realizing their goals, or even attending to ordinary everyday tasks. So, how do we know if we have anxiety? Signs include, but are not limited to, the following: faster heartbeat, breathing more quickly, muscle weakness or muscle tension, excessive sweating or feeling hot or cold, loose bowels or churning sensations in the stomach, disrupted focus, concentration problems, perhaps feeling frozen or paralyzed, a reduced appetite, dizziness. All of these things might exist on a short-term or long-term basis, but particularly on a long-term basis, people might notice disturbed sleep patterns, headaches, lower self-esteem or viewing themselves differently, and agitation, being very quick to express an annoyance at quite a high degree. Now, these things happen in the body because it's the body's way of preparing for danger. So physiological processes kick in, and people with anxiety experience increased blood flow, and blood sugar is released, so that there's this ability to focus on and respond to what's perceived as an emergency. But these physical sensations can feel very amplified, and the issue with anxiety is that they're out of proportion with the actual danger of any given situation at the time. How does this anxiety differ from typical everyday worry? Well, sometimes even the most typical experiences of worry can be overwhelming, consuming, and difficult to put aside for day-to-day encounters. but it's usually, got a reasonable origin. It might be a reaction to grief, for example, such as loss of life or the loss of a relationship, the loss of one's identity or financial stability, for example. But where the anxiety persists and or kind of spills into several areas of a person's life, this may indicate a wider issue beyond typical worry. Let's just think, for example, of someone who's crossing a busy road. It's normal when we cross a busy road to feel vigilant and to worry about speeding cars passing by us. But someone perhaps with really heightened anxiety and perhaps an anxiety disorder might have really graphic and gory, intrusive thoughts, picturing themselves kind of run over by cars, and they might be having these sorts of thoughts before they even approach a road at all, even if they know they're not approaching a road until later that day or later that week even. So that would be an example of a difference between kind of typical worrying, normal worrying, and something that might indicate a wider problem. There are many theories about anxiety, and one of the most commonly discussed is that it's the result of evolution. Although we may no longer be living like Stone Age humans and escaping threats to our lives each day from predators, for example, our bodies have still evolved over thousands of years, wired kind of in readiness to threats more generally. Now, modern problems tend not to be the kind we can throw a spear at. Instead, they may be about transportation or even simple social interactions. Sometimes a trigger for anxiety is easy to identify, like in the case of phobias, for example. But sometimes it's not as straightforward, and finding out why the anxiety is occurring can take a lot of unpicking and unraveling. Even when a person understands their triggers and the fact that their anxiety is disproportionate, sometimes the emotional or physiological response is still just too powerful and consuming. And this is when third-party intervention can be most helpful. From a medical point of view, anxiety can look very different from person to person, and depending on an individual's symptoms, we could be discussing a phobia, where there's perhaps a good ability to function very well day to day, so long as the object of the fear is successfully kept at bay. And whereas something like generalized anxiety disorder or GAD may present more regularly and kind of hang over everyday mundane tasks that are seemingly unrelated to anxiety. But there's a wide kind of umbrella of different types of anxiety that exist. And it's doctors, it's specialists that can pinpoint where someone might be within the umbrella. So, what gets in the way of optimum mental health? We know that generally there's a lot of research into things such as poverty impacting optimum mental health. With young people in particularly, you have issues with peer groups, family dynamics, particularly where there's domestic violence or abuse or even divorce. Some parenting styles can aggravate mental health disorders. Sexuality and gender, as well as racism and discrimination of all sorts, can have an impact on mental health. And the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of the above issues. Today, I'll be looking specifically at the impact of stigma on mental health, the rise in technology, which among other things has had an impact on feelings around perfectionism that can antagonize feelings of anxiety, the notion of abundance in our society, sort of culturally, how having a lot of choice can kind of exacerbate perfectionist lifestyles or tendencies, and that negative impact on mental health. Schooling, exams, unhelpful thinking patterns, it's these sorts of things that I'll be going into specifically in relationship to young people's mental health and anxiety in particular. So stigma, it's out there, embedded culturally around us, and can really impact on young people disclosing their experiences to the people who they're in their care. Now, even where young people have very open and honest relationships with caregivers, they still may hold back, perhaps for fear of hurting or worrying their loved ones. They may also not want to burden what they perceived as overstretched services. So it's important to encourage young people, but also worried carers, to be as knowledgeable as possible about signposting and where young people can go if they don't want to upset the adults in their life, but still really need to talk and need some kind of third-party engagement. And where there is a waiting list, as often there are, what can be done in the meantime? How can caregivers kind of hold that space with the young people in their lives? And those are some of the things that we'll look at a little bit later on. A Time to Change survey once found that young people experience stigma from a surprising variety of places, and also in many different ways. So you can see the impact is wide-ranging and comes from, some surprising sources, even as much as close friends. Now, there's some evidence that the pandemic has shone a light on mental illness and perhaps is beginning to normalize it. However, stigma is, very deeply embedded culturally, unlikely to shift entirely quickly. So I think being aware of stigma, either real or perceived, is crucial to helping young people navigate through the difficult experiences. This might mean advocating on behalf of young people who perhaps don't feel confident speaking up for themselves, particularly in the early stages of identifying or seeking any treatment or interventions. We know another aspect of life that can have a huge impact on mental health is technology, and it, there's often huge advantages in so many ways with technology, and yet it can come with quite a heavy cost from a mental health perspective. Some psychologists go as far as comparing the addictive nature of online use to the effects of drugs, such as cocaine, for example. It might sound extreme, but some even believe that the internet should come with health warnings similar to those found on packaging for other legal drugs or medication. obviously the reality is that this is very unlikely to happen. But also, most young people get a lot of joy out of using technology. So we need to be mindful of that as we discuss some of the traps of technology today. One of the biggest issues with technology is that sometimes young people, particularly preteens, for example, might find it really difficult to distinguish between what's real and what's fake online. I mean, even as adults, fake news can be a really difficult thing to navigate. But the younger the user of online resources, the harder that navigation becomes. If we look at professional influencers online, people like Zoella, for example, I think this is an influencer with over 11 million followers. She's paid vast sums of money to present what's really a very skewed version of herself. And influencers more generally can often leave young people questioning themselves and unfairly comparing themselves or feeling pressure to change things like their diet or hair or shape. Question whether they should be having more, better, or different holidays or living their life differently more generally. Online, it's sometimes difficult to get away from very obvious narcissism, where valuing money, fame, and image can come at quite a great cost. And that can result in an impact on anxiety, of course, low mood and depression as well. And even where young people have learned to be more savvy about this, they may still suffer from FOMO or fear of missing out and feel left out when they're made aware of friends gathering without them, for example. Even where friendships are perhaps more resilient, young people can still feel more kind of existential anxiety, if you like, from things like constant 24-hour news cycles, reporting on very heavy global topics such as the environment, climate change, war, and of course these are going to have an impact on mental health and exacerbate things like anxiety. Underlying all of these ways that technology can impact on a young person is the very practical use of blue light in a lot of devices, which can seriously disturb sleep cycles. And we know that good sleep hygiene is absolutely essential to balance mental health and physical health. So technology has a lot to answer for, but so does a more general trend emerging from many economically developed countries like the UK. In many ways, we're fortunate to live with abundance and a myriad of choices on offer every single day. As you can see here, the examples that I've used are things like Tesco's offering lots of milk choices and Levi's having all of these hundreds of types of jeans. We're told this is a good thing, but there is a flip side to all of this choice in that many people, particularly young people, trying to establish their identities, it might feel as though there's no excuse for making less than the absolute perfect choice. And if you consider people who have far less choices in their lives, people living with more scarcity, they're in a way kind of absolved of that level of personal blame or responsibility, where people are given no choice and made the best of what little they have had. There's some evidence that mental health can sometimes be a bit better. But for young people growing up with a range of choices, making the wrong decision can feel like personal failure. So this can be, very overwhelming headspace to occupy. Young people can become obsessed, perhaps, with making the right choice every time, which can lead to feeling perhaps disempowered or even frozen, too scared to make a choice. And I'm, certainly not advocating for more scarcity in our society. And things like poverty can have an adverse impact on mental health, of course. I think it's useful for parents and carers to understand, though, how having choice can be as much of a good thing as it can be triggering, particularly for things like anxiety. It can also be useful to deploy more messages in the home of good enough to the young people in our lives, and also positive messaging around making mistakes, reframing mistakes as learning opportunities, and bouncing back from failures. You could think, for example, of your own examples of failures, things around choices you've made which felt wrong at the time but ended up working out. It could be that in hindsight you wouldn't have actually done it any other way, or if you could, you can see the learning that has come out of that situation. And it can be something like failing a driving test, a job interview that went badly, or a job you didn't get, a romantic partner who got away, perhaps. Young people can benefit from hearing real life failure stories from real people in their lives who, generally haven't failed and have found their way through it and out of it. Another source of pressure or anxiety may be, in a way, baked into our school system. Exams used to be only at 16 and 18. Now they start at 5 with baseline assessments, and then these occur yearly. Now there are more GCSEs on offer than ever before, and even a wider range of grading than in previous generations. Staff facilitating learning are heavily scrutinised, under pressure from league tables and Ofsted, for example. And even where young people are unschooled or homeschooled, they can still feel the effects by a more general squeeze on resources, which has seen the closing of youth groups and activity centres, or harder to access support for specific treatment for special educational needs and disabilities, like even accessing speech and language therapists via the NHS, for example. All venues for education have been hit as well, with mixed messages about navigating the pandemic and controlling or not controlling COVID. Some schools have been more vigilant in some areas, where others have been less so. Some schools doing nativities, others not during the pandemic. And I think this has been very anxiety provoking for young people, because there hasn't been consistent, clear boundaries, meaning that it's been even harder to know what the right thing is to be done. And not just in an educational sense around exams, for example, but with regard to health as well. Although all of what I'm outlining here is painting our lifestyles as potentially highly stressed, stress isn't in and of itself always a bad thing. At least it doesn't have to be. If we look, for example, at this diagram, we can see it's illustrating that the right amount of stress can actually be a very good thing. If we can go just a bit out of our comfort zone, we often make our greatest achievements and do our best learning. If we are too consistently, however, operating outside of a healthy amount of stress, then we become overwhelmed. So what do we do about it? The trick with stress is to work on our perception of it, as well as trying to minimize or mitigate kind of obvious external stressors that we can potentially avoid. How we perceive stress, though, influences its impact, and this is sometimes referred to as the biology of courage. Making sure we have a helpful inner voice when we're struggling is ultimately the key to reducing stress. I'm not going to tell you that young people should, just think more positively, because I think this could risk being, pretty highly dismissive. But I will offer some practical steps towards the end of this webinar to address unhelpful thinking patterns that are worth considering in a supportive way that, doesn't minimize a young person's very legitimate experiences. What we don't want to happen to the young people in our lives is for their encounters to be so repeatedly negative that they develop a negative narrative about themselves. This is sometimes referred to as unhelpful thinking patterns. Therapies like CBT can be effective at working with issues like this. Where a young person is stuck in a particular mindset, carers and parents can find it upsetting, of course, to observe, but also very difficult to shift sometimes. So anxiety feeds on avoidance. The more a feared situation is avoided, the greater the anxiety is likely to become. So it is wise to avoiding as much as possible, but also as gently as is possible. Facing fears in small, manageable chunks is the best start to addressing anxiety issues. Some people are capable of doing this for themselves. Some need a bit more guidance and assistance, but ultimately self-awareness is crucial. Helping the young person in our lives understand themselves a bit better by reflecting on their feelings and their thoughts, perhaps tracking them, talking them through as much as possible, but at their own pace. This is all really helpful as first steps to addressing anxiety. And the reason why I've got a picture of a mountain here is to, try and think of overcoming an anxiety mental health disorder, not as, what is it going to look like when we get to the top of Everest and it's completely gone, but instead, what would the next summit look like? And trying to break it down into smaller, more manageable chunks so that we're, not too much in our own comfort zones, but just a little bit out of our comfort zone when we're thinking about managing anxiety. A really important point worth considering is the issue of biology. The brain, it's not actually finished developing until around the age of 25. And the last part to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is right behind the forehead. And one of the things it does is to assess risk. So in a way, this is why you probably did things when you were younger, I'm guessing, that you wouldn't dream of doing now. And it's also why the young people in your life assess risk less well than you. Although without practicing getting it wrong and bouncing back from mistakes, obviously they'll struggle to develop the resilience they need to meaningfully and confidently move past mistakes later on in life. So it's really helpful to remember that there is going to be a time when risk can be assessed better with the young people in our lives. I mean, very, very small children and babies often use the oldest parts of the brain, the reptilian amygdala, which is driven by intense emotion, not necessarily thinking so much as kind of fear, anger, hate, panic, grief at high levels of intensity with little self-awareness. And this part of the brain is, also what adults use regularly, but particularly when they're facing dangerous situations. And the impressive thing about the brain is that talking about our most explosive feelings can often help us file them in our brains in a way to make them feel more manageable. So the takeaway here is, look, the young person in your life is going to get better at assessing risks, so hang in there. But also, they still need your guidance, and the key is to talk through what's going on for them as much as possible, as frequently as possible, but in a way that is also not pressurizing or stressful to the young person or yourself. Now, if you have ever had any training about children at all, you'll probably already have seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And essentially, it's a way of picturing the needs of people in a practical way. Now, the foundation for all human well-being, according to Maslow and many others, is this basic physiological needs like food and water and sleep. The idea is that without these, it's almost impossible to reach our highest potential or to develop good self-esteem and confidence, friendships. So you need one to build on to the next in a way. As a caregiver, you can also consider your role in ensuring that basics are met in order to address any mental health struggles. So, for example, if we think about a young person who maybe is too anxious to attend school, it might not be beneficial to go in guns blazing with, maths tutors, English tutors, all of that sort of thing. And if they don't have something as basic as a good sleep routine set up first, because then the problem might be that all of this help in the form of tutors arrives, but there isn't even an ability to concentrate. So I guess what I'm trying to highlight here is about getting the help in the right order so that we can maximize the impact that it's going to have on a young person. As an adult, you can help the young person in your life work out the steps that they might need to take, but also then remind them of their achievements so that they perhaps feel more empowered to take steps further up the pyramid, if you like, that might be potentially more daunting or more complex. From a more practical point of view, if technology is affecting the young person in your life, they may benefit from a really transparent safety plan. This may mean sitting them down, asking them what their online triggers are, and suggesting boundaries that will help them feel better about themselves, less overwhelmed, generally safer. Many young people are actually really good at identifying what's unhelpful about using their devices, and they just need adults to help remind them and help them maintain those boundaries. It works really well when young people understand the theory behind any boundaries or rules that are set up, particularly if they have a say about the timing and the nature of the limits to technology use, and particularly if they feel trusted by their carers to make good decisions. Suggestions might be things like finding an app to help limit screen time. There's lots out there. So which one might be best for you and your household? Having a curfew, perhaps, or zones in the home where devices aren't allowed, such as the dinner table or overnight in bedrooms, particularly for young people. Technology holidays can be tried out, and this might involve perhaps part of a day, regular points in the month, such as weekends chosen in advance and with agreement, or it could be for longer stretches of time while camping, for example. Of course, any steps taken willingly by a young person, however small, should always be applauded. And as much as is possible, to seek it, any decisions made as a partnership. As a simple rule of thumb, you can also try to look out for any of these phrases. Okay, no one, disaster, everyone, always, rubbish, never, hopeless, fail. We refer to these sorts of phrases as polarized thinking. And if you ever catch any of these being used in the home or out and about, it's a good idea to openly challenge them, perhaps even correct yourself if you're using them in front of your family if you feel up to it. So maybe it might look like burning dinner one evening, and if we catch ourselves saying something like, well, this is a disaster, why am I always so terrible at cooking? But if we can follow it up with something like, actually, sometimes I'm alright at cooking, I just made a mistake tonight, we can still save this meal by, I don't know, adding some chopped tomatoes or whatever. This kind of everyday modeling can be really powerful, and it can be even more powerful if we catch young people doing it themselves, and if they can overhear us talking about how great it is that they're doing that to another adult. That can be really powerful and really help the young person develop a narrative of, I've got this and I can overcome things. And it might seem silly, my example with cooking, but I think the more of these simple little low-level examples that you can provide, the better, because it builds up. The thing is that addressing the way we speak to ourselves, that inner voice that I was talking about earlier, it's a really important part of the process when addressing anxiety. When we think something is wrong or we feel badly, this is a really good indicator that we need to stop what we're doing, listen to ourselves and take stock of a situation. But we need to be really clear that there's nothing empowering about worry just for worry's sake. It's draining of energy, and I think we all to some extent have that experience of the fear of something happening, being worse than the actual thing itself when it does happen. So when talking to young people, we don't want to send a message to them that you can't trust your thoughts or you are seeing things wrong. You should be thinking differently or you should be feeling differently. I think this can be experienced as straight up gaslighting. Everyone has a right to their feelings, but what we want to do is to encourage young people to see as many sides to their situation as possible and to feel free to make choices, to be able to choose how they want to view their situation instead of stuck with one viewpoint. So, for example, instead of this is all terrible and nothing will ever be right, we can begin to say things like, this feels terrible right now, but I can still do, X, Y, Z to feel as though we have options is a really, really good tip from a cognitive point of view. So if we're trying to get a young person to open up about their experience so that they can begin to talk through what it is that is bothering them, there are some things to consider when trying to engage in a meaningful conversation. Have a look at these questions and consider how you might describe a good listener. Everyone will respond differently to the question, what makes a good listener? For some people, it would be really off-putting if they were met by just nodding and paraphrasing. For others, it might feel intrusive if someone is speaking too much when they're trying to discuss their experiences themselves. So a lot of this process with young people is trial and error, and it can be really good to model, getting it wrong in a resilient way. So if a young person you're trying to speak with begins to shut down with however you're, employing your good listening, we can apologize and we can ask them very specifically, how can we do it better? It's important to try to act on any of the tips offered, and if the young person in your life is unsure where to start, it can be beneficial to have some ideas to try out yourself. So, is a private or familiar space going to work best for the young person in your life when they need to open up and talk? Or would they prefer being out in the open air, going for a walk by the sea, for example? Does it help having a pet to cuddle and stroke when they speak? Or a family photo album to initiate conversation? Does a young person like to have short conversations in the car so they know they don't have to maintain eye contact, or so that they know the conversation won't drag on for too long? Are you likely to be interrupted, or will they have your full attention? This is quite possibly one of the most important factors to consider when trying to help a young person speak about their difficulties. If you are interrupted, or if it isn't a good time, saying it's not a good time now, but then being really clear about when you can listen is a really, really good thing to have up your sleeve. But let's have a look at some things that may or may not be part of the good listening from your perspective. So you can be thinking, what is it that you would respond to? What perhaps have you seen work well with the young person in your life? And really just try to engage with that as much as possible and employ whatever it is that you see working as often as possible. Once you've got to a point where a young person has opened up a little bit, or they're in the process of opening up and sharing with you, once feelings have been acknowledged and a young person is in a receptive headspace, this is the time to encourage perhaps thinking about solutions or goals. Do try to avoid making suggestions or identifying goals when a young person is in a really heated state. If there's any kind of meltdown or a highly charged experience or really strong raw emotion, it's probably not the best time to try and turn it into a learning experience. That would be better off in hindsight once things are less charged. Also, do try to avoid using the word but. If you can use and instead, it can sound just a little less kind of confrontational. So, for example, I hear what you're saying about feeling humiliated, and I wonder what might be some good next steps. Instead of, I hear what you're saying, but what are some good next steps? Because it's subtle, but it can just, one can sound dismissive, whereas the other less so. You want to be focusing on asking the young person what they need, what might make things feel not perfect, but less bad, or perhaps ask them what has worked in the past, or perhaps taking them out of their own headspace and saying, well, look, if you were your best friend, what would you suggest to yourself? If you had a wand and you could wave it over the situation and change one thing immediately, what would that one thing be? I wouldn't suggest firing all of these questions out all at once, by the way, but kind of having these in the back of your mind to throw out if a conversation seems to slow down or stale, if you want to kind of get the ball rolling. And if you have a creative young person in your life, they may enjoy, making a box of things that kind of lift their mood or distract themselves. It could be a box of favorite textures, smells, images, memories, photos, or they could create a mantra and carry it on a card. They could write a list of everyone who loves them or all the obstacles that they've overcome in their life. They may have a small object they can carry with them that reminds them of a happy or safe place. For example, a stone from the beach, or a pressed flower from a loved one's garden, perhaps. Things like this are referred to as transitional objects, and they can help ground a person when they're feeling overwhelmed. One thing that's really important to point out is to check in with yourself. Caring for a young person is often hard, even when things are going as planned or smoothly. So it's wise to make sure that you have enough self-care in place to be able to support them. Put on your own mask first, as the slogan goes. And it can be worth considering whether you have any perhaps unresolved hurts from your own childhood, and whether there are any habits that you feel you want to change in the relationship you have with young people in your life. And there's no one single right way to parent a young person, but it can be useful to wonder if there's any habits you've noticed that help or hinder your relationship. Your style of parenting might work brilliantly with one young person in your care and just not gel very well with another. It's not possible to be a perfect fit to everyone all the time. So having space to reflect on that and to work out a way forward with particular young people in our lives can be really helpful. Some research shows that there can sometimes be common parenting messages that might hinder mental health in young people. So if you've noticed that you're prone to, only the best will do, or pushing for high achievement or perfectionism, these things will lend to a more stressful environment, particularly someone who's suffering with anxiety. I need to make decisions for you because you can't make decisions for yourself. Things like what to do in spare time, choosing clothes, choosing friends, choosing food. If there's too much micromanagement particularly during adolescence. This can be really anxiety provoking for young people. But on the other side of the spectrum, if there's no rules at all and there's a really permissive style of parenting, that can feel to some young people as though they're not being held. That sense of no boundaries being there can feel really unsafe. Also, swinging unpredictably between permissive parenting and more authoritarian or micromanaging parenting can be really anxiety provoking, particularly if a young person doesn't know which way the parent or the carer is going to go. So these are things that are worth considering when trying to establish a trusting relationship with a young person and encourage meaningful communication with them. So, in summary, things that are helpful for those who are experiencing anxiety. Firstly, any opportunities to open up should be encouraged. Speaking to a trusted adult is the most ideal situation, but it could also look like journaling, for example. And if the young person in your life isn't up for this, perhaps it's worth considering journaling yourself when you are making observations about things that help or hinder the progress of the young person in your life. Remembering the importance of physiology is another really good thing to have at the back of your mind. Of course, exercise is important to mental health, getting the endorphins going, but movement, particularly outdoors, can be really useful and beneficial to mental health. Recognize that physiological needs like sleep are really important, and that they need to be in place before the emotional and psychological benefits can follow. Calming. Typical strategies to relieve stress and worry from our lives, like mindfulness or yoga, are obviously things that can be encouraged, but it can also be things like the box of happiness triggers that I mentioned earlier, or a transitional object or mantra carried around in one's back pocket. Learning a new skill. Remember that taking oneself out of the comfort zone is a good idea for building confidence, as long as it's not too far out of the comfort zone. And as an adult in the life of your young person, you can use that then later on as an example. You can point to it as a reference to your young person, like, look, you learned this new skill, you learned a new way of doing this, you conquered difficulties. So I believe you can overcome this challenge now in the future. Relating. Now look, this might be completely different if we're talking about an introvert or an extrovert, but ultimately anything that helps a young person feel a part of something bigger than themselves is going to be really helpful. And this might be encouraging a young person to attend a self-help group for anxiety, but it could just as easily be something unrelated to mental health. Any kind of workshop or club or group that they feel kind of tapped into is going to allow them an opportunity to feel a sense of belonging and minimize feelings of isolation. Contributing, having opportunities to increase the well-being of others in the community can be another really good way to build self-esteem in a young person, but also to help them distract themselves from unhelpful thinking traps. This might be about involvement in a local charity, but it could just as easily be something as unstructured as walking an elderly neighbour's dog, for example. Creating. If you have a creative young person in your life, then, of course, encourage them to harness this to express their anxiety. But even less creative individuals can benefit from creative arts, in the privacy of their own homes, without feeling watched by anyone or judged by anyone. Things like drawing, painting, making music, people don't have to be good at them to benefit from them. They're all very good ways for people to address worries, particularly if someone has a tendency to overthink, or if they're in the very kind of earliest stages in identifying triggers. And lastly, a really important part of supporting anyone who is suffering with anxiety is to help them recognize even the small steps that they take to do any of these things on the screen here. If they are taking a step to open up, even if it doesn't really work, if you like, just taking that step, just opening the door is enough to recognize, acknowledge, and applaud. Any kind of attempts to express, to try something new, abandoned one of those polarized phrases that we discussed earlier. Parents and caregivers are really well placed to spot these achievements and then meaningfully acknowledge them and remember them for future reference. Now, when it comes to working with a third party for interventions or treatment, CBT is often very helpful for people struggling with anxiety, and there are options accessible through your GP. But in addition to this, medication can be helpful for short-term alleviation, although it won't get to the root of the problem, so it really is best paired with a talking therapy. Support groups, as I've mentioned, can also provide a good insight into, the common experiences of others in order to limit feelings of isolation. But also something to think about when shopping for a therapist, if that's the road that you want to go down. Not all therapists will be a good fit, so be prepared to kind of try them on for size, if you like. Do try to involve the young person in your life as much as possible in the decision-making process. Perhaps they can be vetting who you visit and who you try out as a therapist. Be wary of anyone suggesting any silver bullets, particularly with more complex anxiety disorders. They will often require time and a variety of approaches. All therapists should ultimately be aiming to become redundant and to enable the young person they're working with to kind of do it for themselves at some point. And all therapists should also leave a door open for future therapy if the young person needs to or wants to or wishes to return to therapy at another point further down the line. It's far better for a therapist to not in any way pressurize anyone they work with. But I think if a young person is experiencing therapy or counselling for the first time, they need to know it's entirely on their own terms and they can step back from it or step into it at any point. The other thing I would mention is that there is a lot of support online. Now, if you can try to access the support that is as kind of local to you as possible, that's a really good starting point. I've listed 2 websites here of hundreds that you could potentially tap into. but the more local they are, the more relevant and potentially up to date the listings will be. So do try to bear that in mind. Also, please don't hesitate if you are on these websites to reach out, contact these organizations if you want to ask specific questions or ask for signposting in your local area. So that's it from me. Please leave your feedback so that we can continue to create even better resources, and thank you so much for listening.